Good morning. I'm Reese Potterville, the president of the Graduate Theological Union, and we are very happy to have you here today. Many of you have traveled some distance to participate in this special time to focus on the teaching and pedagogy of Judith Berling. We're also very happy to have an audience through live streaming today. The service is provided by Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and California Lutheran University. Those two schools are now merged into one entity, and we're grateful that they have enabled us to reach a wider audience. The conference is called Learning as Collaborative Conversation, Celebrating the Scholarship and Teaching of Judith Berling. She developed this way of teaching during her years, beginning in 1987 at the GTU. And in many ways, in addition to teaching the Chinese traditions of Taoism and Confucianism, and went forward until the arrival of Uriah Kim, our new academic dean, arriving in January. So I'm really grateful that she many times has put her own personal freedom and perhaps desires behind her loyalty to the institution. And it's part-time, so we've strictly limited her to no more than 85 hours a week. This conference will be followed by another conference sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation. They have been generous supporters of interreligious education for the last decade or more, and they're busy looking at these projects and measuring the outcomes and the effect that they have had on graduate and undergraduate education. So I know Michael Gilligan is here, and you'll have a chance to meet him as the executive of the foundation and president. And so we're just very happy that we could wrap these two together. And so many of the participants could be at both events. Finally, I just want to say a special word of thanks to Emily Wu and Sophia Park and Arthur Holder for myriad meetings. We have planning this amongst busy people is not an easy task. And they have really given generously of their time and talent to make this conference possible and to shape it. And of course, there are many other volunteers and people who have tried to make the hospitality of the GTU yours to enjoy in this day and a half. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator facilitator, Jenny Te Pa Daniel, and she will introduce herself and we'll carry on from there. Thank you.
Warm greetings to you all, and thank you so much for coming to share in what I know will be a fabulous day of reminiscing, of honouring, of recalling with humour and with seriousness the ways in which so many of our lives and careers have been touched, indeed been blessed by our associations and our friendships with Professor Judith Berling. I want also, first, in opening the session, to do what would be done so naturally in my own Indigenous context, and that is first to give thanks in abundance for the opportunity of gathering as we are, and secondly, to acknowledge and thus to bring into the gathering the memories of those we have loved and who are no longer of this world. I do so especially as I am sure Judith has her beloved Rhoda so close to her heart this day, And as I know, Rhoda will be sitting off-centre somewhere in those funky Dame Edna glasses she used to wear, cheering us all on as we pay such deserved tribute to the love of her life. And so we pause for just a moment to recall the sacred memories of those to whom we are each indebted. Thank you. My task this morning is especially gratifying. I'll be facilitating this first session, whereby a panel of distinguished scholars and academics will shortly share with us something of their very particular experiences of working professionally alongside Judith, of being taught by her, of being inspired by her, and possibly some may even share stories of being, as in my case, deservedly disciplined by her. This first session will go through until midday, and I hope will be relaxed and yet substantive. Our 6 panellists will each speak for around 7 minutes, one after the other, and then we will have time for engagement among and between yourselves as audience and with the panellists, between the panellists themselves and or with Judith, should that be indicated. The idea is that we relax and enjoy 6 very different and yet crucial perspectives of engagement which span the past 20 years, with Judith the teacher, Judith the teaching colleague, Judith the consummate educator, Judith the visionary, Judith the mentor. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Jenny Tipar Daniel. My second name is my tribal name, the name which connects me to the tribe, the people, and the land to which I will forever belong as an Indigenous Māori woman. In 1994, my people sent me on a mission to complete a PhD in order that I might return and assist in the project of transfiguring the Anglican Church's preeminent seminary in New Zealand into becoming a place of welcome and of academic flourishing for Māori students. This after a shameful 150-year legacy of the seminary systematically failing to meet the pastoral and academic needs of many Māori men who had been enrolled. I hasten to add that most of these same men went on to become very fine priests and servant leaders, in spite of and likely because of their seminary experience, even if none of the earliest generations were ever destined to the highest of ecclesiastical offices or to the ranks of church governance. As I'm sure you will all agree, it is not ever acceptable that any are unjustly denied access to the quality of theological education befitting their own God-given cultural and linguistic gifts. But such has been the case for way too many years, for Indigenous peoples, for minorities, for women in our shared histories of involvement in seminary education. By the early 1990s, and yes, I know that was only yesterday, Māori Anglicans called unequivocally for an end to our exclusion from the seminary, and we determined instead that the very well-endowed National Seminary was as much ours as anyone's. And so the agreed strategy was to prepare an outstanding leader in theological education to, well, lead the way. Then, having made this momentous decision that I was to be their chosen one, they kind of left me to figure out how to do a PhD. Well, fortunately, God was being incredibly attentive at this point, and so it was that my boss at the time, who was a former Archbishop and Governor-General and the first Anglican observer to the United Nations, was coming to CDSP with that kind of imprimatur to receive an honorary doctorate degree. And before he left, he asked me if there was anything I wanted him to do for me. I begged him to keep an eye out for a school where I could do my doctoral work, but more importantly, to identify a professor who would get me for who I was, as a feisty, feminist, fledgling theological educator who happened to be, at that time, a young, divorced, lay Anglican Indigenous woman. What was my subject again, he queried as he fled the campus. Race politics and theological education, I blurted out into the ensuing gloom. Well, a week or so later, he returned to New Zealand and announced with absolute certainty that he had found a perfect match. He had met Judith Berling. And so began our collaborative partnership. Judith and I began a correspondence, which eventually led to a meeting, which led to an enrolment, and a 4.5-year torturous academic journey, as much for me as it certainly was for Judith. And ultimately it led to what I at least consider to be a very fine PhD. All modesty aside, it is without doubt the foundational intellectual work which Judith gifted me and so many of you since, that I too now salute her for. Her determination to enable within each of us the development of a fearless, critical mind, her insistence upon evoking from within ourselves a radical imagination, her normative assumption that we would and should boldly and confidently give voice to our own blessedly unique ideas and understandings, and we are to do so in order to do two things. Firstly, it was and is right and proper at times to completely disrupt prevailing educational paradigms of dominance and thus of injustice. And secondly, it was and still is also right and proper to add perspective to previously monolingual and monocultural pedagogy, curriculum, assessment, and so on. In other words, those traditionally excluded from the academy are quite capable and willing to enrich and enhance educational experiences for all, and not just for ourselves. And yes, I know the risks inherent, but whoever said risk-taking wasn't mandatory for those committed to the pursuit of justice? And so it was all of this, as well as her indomitable but utterly dependable presence during those dark days, which every PhD immersion inevitably gives rise to, that has bound me inexorably to Judith from that very first day to this. I am therefore unequivocal in saying that I have been able to do what I have done over the past 2 decades and more as a globally acclaimed leader in Anglican theological education because of Professor Judith Berling. And so while I may have crossed half the world to be here today, I can assure you I would have crossed the entire globe, if need be, to pay tribute to my beloved Judith. Now, I don't know if Judith ever saw this, because most of us as professors now don't rush to the acknowledgements of every PhD that's ever submitted, but in concluding, I just want to share with you all what I wrote now 16 years ago in the acknowledgement pages of my own PhD. Judith Berling has been teacher, mentor, wise one, and academic supervisor extraordinaire. It is Judith who has taught me to be unafraid of claiming the intellectual authority of my own voice, even in the face of significant opposition. It is Judith who has taught me so much about what a truly liberatory teaching pedagogy might look like, even when there is considerable institutional resistance. It is Judith who has taught me that it's actually quite okay to laugh out loud and not care about who's looking. So for the gift of your outstanding scholarship, for the blessings of your wonderful friendship, and for the constancy of your expectation of no less than excellence, I thank you, Judith. Now I really must turn to share this time with our fabulous panellists. I met with them all yesterday for the first time, and we discussed a possible methodology for this session. And basically it would be that I would introduce each speaker by name and mention just a little bit of what they wish to contribute. In order to assist me, they each very helpfully provided a brief synopsis of what they have prepared. Well, I have to say that upon reflection, after we met, I realised I was actually so completely riveted by each one of their offerings that I have now decided I want you to have that same first-hand experience as I, and not to spoil their surprise, as it were. And so let me then first introduce Munir Jiwa, Director and Associate Professor in the Centre for Islamic Studies. Professor Munir has known Judith since around 2007 as co-teaching colleague in the Issues of Study of Religion seminar. Professor Munir, I invite you to the podium.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Greetings of peace to you all. A warm welcome to all those who have come from near and far. When we're in the company of Judith, it's always near, not far. So I wanted to just share with you some notes I had prepared, but I think I might just want to talk from my heart. In a recent meeting around branding and rebranding the GTU and what comes to mind when we think about GTU, part of our task was to list the things that make us think about the GTU and what we would want others to know. Acknowledging and affirming religious tradition, interreligious traditions, interdisciplinarity, intra-religious, engaged, innovative, collaborative, respect for difference, dignity, integrity. All these words came to mind, and I thought about our motto, where religion meets the world, or sometimes I drop the W and just say, here, religion meets the world. And then I thought about it, and I said, you know, these are all terms that are actually terms that remind me of Judith. And then I said, wait, is Judith the institution? And I kid you not, I thought they were so overlapping that I had to kind of go through, okay, what is it that is different about Judith from the institution? I wanted to share with you, I know Judith in many different contexts. From her reputation preceded my coming here, which was through the AAR. I had known her work in interreligious studies. A lot of her community outreach I had known about, of course, being a past president of the AAR, and her contributions, of course, in Asian religions. And I wanted to share with you just my particular kind of relationship with Judith through the course that we taught together, which is a required doctoral seminar called Contemporary Issues in the Study of Religion. And we've taught it every other year for 6 years, and all the doctoral students in the cultural and historical studies of religions, but many other areas, now departments, take this course. And that course has been not only just a course that I've been privileged to co-teach with Judith, but has been a constant learning exercise for me as well. To go through this course has been, you know, I say to the students, you think we have the answers. It's sort of, we're working with you. It is really, in that sense, collaborative. The learning is absolutely collaborative. It's also really refreshing, since my specific area is in Islamic studies. It's also refreshing to be in conversation with students who are working across traditions, times, spaces, and I'll give you some examples to see how amazing this is. But in this class, we attend to those pesky research questions, as we call them, the ones that don't go away and we don't know how to actually it. It's a must-have. Thinking through our questions, research questions. It's called The Craft of Research by Booth, Colomb, and Williams, which I'll come back to. So we begin with that. We ask questions around space and time. We ask questions around what is religion? What do we mean by the term religion? Does the term itself translate across cultures and times? What do we mean by culture? What do we mean by spirituality? So there's conceptual issues we try to get at. We move to questions around modernity and postmodernity. We ask questions around the hermeneutics of suspicion. We try to get at methodologies and multiple methodologies that might work or not work for different traditions and in different contexts. We look at issues of race and issues in a class. And I just want to share with you the kinds of conversations that I've been privileged to be part of in this class. So drawing on some of the conversations, and you would think, where could this happen? Well, it happens in the class with Judith. A student who has been working on banking of cord blood in the Arab Gulf and has been looking at encounters of religion with biotechnology, comes in conversation with another student who works on 20th century Bauhaus art in Germany, Colette. What do these people have in common? What are they going to say to each other? It happens in the classroom, and they ask important questions of each other. Another student who was working on looking at tracing the developments in Deobandi and Barelvi discourses from British India to contemporary Pakistan is in conversation with another student who's working on being and Heidegger. What does that conversation look like? What do they have in common? Another student who's working on Islamic chaplaincy comes into conversation with students who are working on areas of race and racism and gender. So you're starting to get a sense of how amazing these classrooms are, and what do these students have in common, except to be in a classroom where Judith somehow brings them in conversation, and I was privileged to be part of that. This year's group, we had other topics that were amazing. Who was looking at how the Warith Deen Muhammad community that came out of the Nation of Islam right here in the United States is how this person is in conversation with the three mysteries of care in the Shingon tradition. What do these have in common? There's another student who's looking at the speculative theology and its influence on Islamic law. That student is in conversation with another student who's looking at how a distributed Roman Catholic community of global expats thinks about its experience and liturgical practices and its sense of community in 3 different parts of the world. So this is giving you a flavor, a sense of the kinds of conversations that are happening in the classroom, and they're not just classroom conversations. They're conversations that are happening far and wide. They're bringing space and time together. They're bringing the global world, and that global world is here in our classroom. And these students develop strong friendships. They work with each other on all sorts of projects inside and outside the classroom. So the learning process, when you think about another tradition, you're like, how would I ever have anything to say about that tradition? By the end of the semester, your colleagues in that class is, okay, I don't need any more information from you. I don't need any more responses. It's so collaborative. People come together in such a way where they thought they would never be able to have a conversation on these topics. And here they are thinking about methodology together, thinking about how they're going to approach these communities, how they're going to interview these communities when it's ethnographic fieldwork, and thinking about ourselves in a global context, which I think is critical. And I know we're supposed to restrict ourselves to a few minutes, so I just want to end with another particular area that Judith helps students with, is to go through that, and all of us who have been in either Judith's class or teaching with her, or probably used in other classes, the Booth, Colomb, and Williams formula, where we ask students to think about their research topics, put them into questions, and then ask the students to think about their audiences. Why do people care about your project? So you kind of go through these, roller coasters, and they're emotional roller coasters as well, because just when you think you have it, you come to a class and you're like, I don't think I know this. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm out of this program. And then by the end of the semester, you're relieved. But the formula goes something like this. I want to study and explore A, because I want to find out who, what, when, what, whether, why, and how, B, our research question, so that C, our audience, can understand or do something. So I want to offer this in closing to Judith, something I have had to model for the students as well, and it's in honor of her book, Understanding Other Religious Worlds. So Judith, tell me how I did, don't grade me. I want to convene a translation project with scholars from around the world, because I want to learn how they localize their understanding of other religious worlds so that scholars of religious and interreligious studies and dialogue can learn about the impact of global contexts of religion and of the religious, interreligious, intra-religious, interdisciplinary, and intercultural, as exemplified in the life and work of Dr. Judith Berling, teacher, mentor, translator, mediator, and my friend. Thank you.
Next, let me introduce Devin Zuber, Assistant Professor of American Studies, Religion and Literature, to offer his reflections of working alongside Professor Berling. Devin.
Unlike Munir's wonderful reflections that we just heard, I've prepared something a little more formal, but I'll try and improvise in the spirit of the importance of play and a lot of Judith's pedagogy. My reflections today are about learning other religious worlds in a time of climate change. I'm going to sort of pick up some threads out of Judith's thinking and teaching that I think are electric wires in my own field of work and research. I never thought I would be happy to break my sabbatical and return to Berkeley, but here I am gathered with so many people from not just different religious traditions, different cultures, but from all over the world. It's a testament to the power and impact of Judith's teaching and thinking that we have a microcosm of the globe gathered in this space. I had the great pleasure of teaching the interdisciplinary seminar with Judith 2 years ago, and as a relative greenhorn to the GTU, I had left a very large state-run German public university system to the complexity of all these moving parts and pieces of the GTU, where still after a year in, I couldn't keep apart my CDSP from my ABSW. And in addition to the power of teaching and learning with Judith in the classroom, I really appreciated the role she played in taking me under her wing, as she's done for many gathered in this room today, and having conversations with her in her office. Long before I ever thought I'd end up at a place like the GTU and teaching with Judith, I encountered her work when I was writing my dissertation. My background and training is in American studies and literature, and as I was toiling away in Germany 8 years ago, working my way into the field of eco-theology and environmental takes on religion and religious culture, I encountered her response to Mary Evelyn Tucker, the prominent eco-theologian and director of Yale's Forum on Religion and Ecology. In 2002, I think in this very space, Mary Evelyn Tucker delivered an important take on the so-called great turning of world religions towards environment and ecological issues, and this became a small book, and it was there at the University of Osnabrück in northern Germany that I first encountered the force of Judith's very particularized and careful thinking about justice issues and the gap between social justice with humans and environmental justice issues with the non-human natural world. And today, even though that response that Judith provided to Mary Evelyn Tucker's lecture is a small part of her large oeuvre of thinking and writing, I want to use that as a launch pad for thinking about the importance of interreligious pedagogy and education in an age of climate change. And some of the responses and questions and gentle critiques that Judith offered in that response to Mary Evelyn Tucker have only become more urgent and trenchant in the last 10 years. Our social justice commitments to our fellow humans still fall quite far short. This was sort of Judith's major point she made with her response. So how can we achieve ecological or environmental parity when our ability to care for one another across religious lines still falls so far short. As Judith puts it quite succinctly, we can't, and I remember underlining this 9-10 years ago in the German university, we can't simply just say, well, now that we've handled human diversity, it's time to move on to the diversity of life in the Earth community. Judith further questions the effectiveness of liberal religious theology to effect broader cultural changes, such as more earth-friendly forms of living that are simpler, given the resurgence of religious fundamentalisms and the relative marginal insignificance of academic discourse, perhaps in particular theology in the larger public sphere. What do we do? And this past year, 2015-2016, has been one of increasingly bad news for the planet, as anyone who pays attention to the media knows. It's a litany I don't need to review here, and the urgency of the situation is perhaps best underscored simply by citing the historical significance mentally related. That's sort of some questions and thoughts I want to lift up from my rereading of this book for this event today. Learning Other Religious Worlds, the Purple Book, was timely and trenchant when it first appeared, and if you read it carefully, you can detect a shadow cast over it by 9/11, which is referenced here and there in the text. The aftermath of that event, the ensuing surge of religious violence and fundamentalisms, underscores some of the text's urgent tones, the claim that for Christians in particular, learning about religious others is not ancillary, it's not an elective option, but fundamentally required for our pluralistic world that's becoming more and more diverse and globalized. So for a thought experiment today, for this question of how the problem of ecological relation might intertwine with the religious other, I would like to momentarily replace the shadow of 9/11 in Learning Other Religious Worlds with the shadow of environmental crisis, to let the specter of climate change hover over some of Judith's claims and suggestions, and think about the implications and some questions that this might raise. And to generalize, for me, when I thought about this, there are two keywords or phrases that came out of this thought experiment. One is the centrality of the imagination, the radical imagination, we might say, to reflect on some of Jenny's remarks. And secondly, that of respecting difference. And in my time remaining, I'm going to talk about the imagination and difference. We all know that Judith's pedagogical sources for her work in interreligious education are multivalent and very diverse. Nevertheless, a consistent pattern coheres in her work that supports the imagination as critically constitutive of vitally important cognitive faculty. In Learning Other Religious Worlds, Judith draws on Maxine Greene and the pragmatism of John Dewey, among others, to bolster the claim that cultivating the imagination is essential for coherence, for picturing how we imagine ourselves in relation with others. There is an implicit and sometimes explicit argument that Judith makes in her work for the seminal importance of works of art, visual and narrative, that they have to play in broadening our imaginative capacities, so central for empathy and effective ethics. For those of us who have taught or learned with Judith in the classroom, we know how important this aspect of imagination and play has been in her collaborative style of teaching. Judith says, and I love this phrase, she says we need to precisely wrestle with strangeness, and that art can help us productively encounter defamiliarizing experiences. And as an aside, although Judith has spent almost all of her professional energy at the GTU, in addition to attending to administration to the interdisciplinary studies area, this unflagging championing of the arts and the imagination has always made her a secret ally of the art and religion area and field. If anything, I think our environmental crisis, this climate change we are living into now, is a colossal failure of the imagination, an inability to see the consequences of our fossil-fueled consumeristic capitalism, among other things, or the inability to see the sacredness of non-human living matter around us. An important question arises here that the work of interreligious pedagogy might push us towards. Where does the failure of ecological imagination intersect with the failure of the religious imagination, the ability to encounter the religious other? Some places of intersectionality here are to be found in what many have termed environmental racism. To trace such environmental racism is to engage in a cartography that maps out where disenfranchised communities are situated in proximity to environmentally hazardous and toxic waste sites. These communities are usually low income, racially minoritized, and sometimes also they constitute the religious other, as is the case with certain Islamic communities, for example, in the Midwest Rust Belt area. And I think perhaps the common cure to follow the practical implications of Judith's understanding other religious worlds is to amplify our encounters with those kinds of artworks or literatures that suture this gap, that bring back together the ability to imagine religious human others and non-human natural pieces of the world. There are many examples of such artworks I think we can all think of. One that I was inspired to teach with after having a chance to work with Judith in the Interdisciplinary Studies Seminar was the Indian-British writer Indra Sinha's novel, Animals People, which is a harrowing yet darkly hilarious fictional retelling of the Union Carbide disaster that happened in Bhopal, India in 1984. And the novel playfully mixes into its account of one of the most tragic examples of environmental racism and pollution, the religious and cultural hybridity of a post-colonial urban Indian city. And to teach this text, me, the possibilities for how the aesthetic could provide a framework where some of the goals of interreligious education, an authentic encounter with the other, could converge in and around environmental concerns. Now, the other second implication for interreligious education in a time of climate change that I want to mention in closing involves Judith's very careful thinking about otherness and difference. And I think this still provides, to go back to her exchange with Mary Evelyn Tucker here in this very room, some valuable rejoinders to ongoing tendencies in eco-theology and certain green spirituality movements. There's a quite sophisticated argument in the Purple Book for the necessity of respecting difference, keeping it open when it comes to learning and listening from others. Judith stakes out her pedagogy against the universalizing tendencies that come embedded in the history of comparative religions, going back to the 1893 World Parliament of Religion and elsewhere. Though well-intentioned, claims for universal sameness under the different dress and guise of various cultures often masks and hides systematic imbalances of power. And this is, of course, the whole post-structural critique of the Enlightenment episteme that Judith here and there sparingly applies in her book. We rather should engage difference, Judith writes, and constrain, hold back our rush to identify similarities, as she puts it. And I think such care and caution is still lacking in some of the broad universalizing claims made for world religions turning or becoming ecologically and globally environmental. I'm quite jet-lagged, having flown in from Germany last night. Theologizing the notion that we share the same sacred earth, Mother Earth or Gaia under our feet, sometimes leads to a pan-universalism, as if all religions could do the same kind of cultural work with adequate and appropriate political affects. Perhaps unwittingly, these universalizing eco-theologies end up replicating the Orientalist paradigms that underwrote the Universalist foundations of the study of comparative religions, and often fetishize, too, a notion of the primitive. A more authentic interreligious environmental pedagogy, to me, it seems, would instead strive to maintain difference, to insist that even if the ground beneath our feet is geologically or ecologically the same, it is yet loaded with very different spiritual valences that pluralizes and transforms its meaning into meanings. Gaia, or Mother Earth, is not some master signifier that can magically hold different eco-theologies under a single green banner, as some of the neo-pagan spiritualities have insisted that continue to draw on the work of Arnenas and his deep ecology. Instead of a singular cosmological universe, Judith's interreligious pedagogy would have its broadest application for eco-theologies and earth-based spiritualities when those are framed by what William James first termed the pluriverse, that multiplicity, hybridity, and strange variation are part of the very fabric of creation and matter. So, to conclude, I find that rereading and rethinking about learning other religious worlds and interreligious pedagogy in a time of climate change is a provocation for me to think forward about what a classroom at the GTU with interreligious dimensions can look like that would more pragmatically address environmental issues. And that such a classroom needs not just one hue of green, but a kind of prismatic, pluralistic ecology, a many-hued rainbow approach to think aesthetically again. And here, some of Judith's practical suggestions for principles and learning about other religions, I think, can be usefully adapted into this kind of prismatic ecology. One of those points emphasized in understanding other religious worlds stresses the essential importance of helping students know and reflect on their own social location through art, text, and narrative. So I think even before you can get to the questions of who, when, what, where, why, how, and A, B, and C, one needs to begin with that space of self-introspection. How did I get here? What is the ground I'm standing on? How might such an attention to social location be broadened to connect to ecological place, towards what Aldo Leopold famously called the land ethic? How can the drawing of such connections avoid too easy comparisons and our tendency to rush to identify parallels, and keep open instead a mutual respect for difference, for listening and learning from the other? For such unsettled questions, fortunately, the GTU remains a rich laboratory to test and try out, thanks in no little part to Judith's fundamental contributions, theoretical and institutional, to how we think about interreligious education. Thank you.
Next to speak is one I remember as a formidable presence in some of my classes here. A courageous and careful scholar, not one given to suffer falls at all, let alone without gladness. Bonnie Howe has known Judith for around 20 years. Doubtless, therefore, some aspect of evolution will insert itself into her contribution. Welcome, Bonnie.
Well, I'm so grateful to be able to participate in a conversation again at the GTU and gathered by and about and with Judith. It's a great honor and privilege. And it's already rich, is it not? What I want to talk about is what we've already been talking about, but perhaps I'll take us back to a more basic level of thinking about the ways we tend to think and we tend to talk when we study religions. Because of course, everyone who knows Judith knows that she taught us that it would be wise to think about, carefully think about how we're thinking and what it even is that we think we're trying to do. So I really just have two major points here and a few variations on the themes. First, and this has already been said, interdisciplinarity matters, period. Judith has ways of getting this across, and so we've already heard this in some ways, but you know her, you know these questions. Are you doing multidisciplinary study or interdisciplinary study? And what model of interdisciplinarity are you using? Is it classical or critical? Is there a primary field that you're working in, mostly identified with, a secondary one? Do you really mean secondary? Are they side by side? How are you going to draw that, if you could? And are you borrowing responsibly from those non-primary fields? Or are you doing something other than borrowing? And if so, what would that be? It gets more specific and interesting if you stick with Judith through that conversation. Yes. So we know that when we ask these kinds of questions, we are asking how we're framing our work. We're slowing it down so that we can notice that we're not only framing the questions, the research questions that we raise, but the kinds of answers that we'll even notice, as well as the answers we'll accept or create, are constrained by those framings that we named and others. So framing within the sphere, the wide sphere of interdisciplinarity, has implications for how our work is brought forth, shaped, carried out, and validated. Each frame carries its own logic and rules and roles, admits some people, and implicitly dismisses others. And that could be a little o or a big O. There's the need for the caution. In the academy, and especially in the Religious Studies Academy, we live in a world framed and bound by containers and the logics they entail. Schools, even, are buildings, and buildings are containers, and areas, and what are we calling them now? Not areas, but disciplines, are metaphorical containers here at the GTU and elsewhere in the academy. The old language, apparently it's old, before the new GTU doctoral program, which I confess I have not studied and I'm not entirely conversant with. But the old language used to be, are you in Area 1 or in Area 4, or are you in IDS? And when we use that little preposition in, we are opening up a container, a space, that can imply, even when we're not thinking about it, that there are edges to those containers, and therefore we come up with language like stovepiping or silos. When did we start having that conversation about silos in the academy? Maybe in the 90s, I'm not sure. By the way, farms in Berkeley? Are there farms in Berkeley? Well, there are silos in academies, and when we use that language of silos, we are borrowing agricultural framing, I guess, even here in Berkeley. Or were you thinking of a missile silo? I mean, I hope not. I mean, it's like, what? So I think metaphors matter. So interdisciplinarity matters, metaphors matter. In the IDS seminar, we often spoke of bridges and of spanning gaps. And I've already heard that kind of language of spanning or suturing gaps this morning. But when we talk about bridging and spanning, of course, we're borrowing framing. We're within the space, framing of engineering, is it, or construction, to describe some of the work we're doing. We're locating links and conduits. We're building, we think, bridges between fields. And then we also are already talking this morning about boundary crossing or cutting across fields. So we're thinking of the fields and the sub-disciplines as bounded spaces. And some of them are large, so large and important. Important, by the way, is big, at least in America, and not just in Texas. They're so important. They're not just small fields, some of them. They're veritable countries that we realize have border crossings that are fairly formal. And some of us, some of you, I mean it, some of you have had trouble at these border crossings and have been queried about your intentions, right, and for your credentials. And some of us have been helped across those borders in very concrete ways by Judith Berling. In fact, I won't be the only one here today, I'm sure, to bear witness to the experience of really knowing that I couldn't have done my GTU degree without Judith, without IDS, because those boundaries may be metaphorical, as I just claimed, but that doesn't mean they're not real. In fact, in my way of thinking, it means they're even more real and powerful. I wanted to study social ethics and Christian scriptures, but the biblical studies people said, well, we hear your intention, that's very honorable and good, but I literally heard this, I'll put it in the first person, I don't do much with ethics. I do New Testament, but we don't do ethics. Seriously, I heard that. And the social ethics people were all like, well, okay, social ethics, we like that. But why do you want to do so much Bible stuff? I mean, a little would be all right, especially if you want to critique the use of it in formation of arguments and so on, but why so much? So the thing is, coming from my original tradition, that disconnect, that bifurcation did not compute. And Judith listened, and Judith made ways for me to go forward. We'll want to remember what we've learned from Judith, with Judith, about what it means to do critical interdisciplinary work and the differences between doing it that way and classical interdisciplinarity and I don't have jet lag, but I can't talk English. I only came from Oakland. Multidisciplinarity, because those framing choices matter, because those are not synonyms. They are not. They are not. When we do theological study with that higher level of awareness of the frames opening up and constraining our work, we will do it better, more carefully, more responsibly. So interdisciplinarity matters. Second big point, unless we also do this study in the flesh, we are doomed. If theological study is a journey, and we often speak of it that way, so we must be thinking of it that way. And in fact, the GTU doctoral program is understood to be a long journey, is it not? Yeah, when I first got here, I was horrified going over to the library one time. I heard, during orientation, I heard some students saying, oh, it's the 7-year club. But 7 years is a little, short for among my cohort. So If we don't do this study in the flesh, we will get stuck, spinning our wheels, or we'll spin out into some ether where the results of our work will be disconnected from life and people and what the churches or the synagogues and so on need. So what do I mean by that in the flesh? Several things, not seven. Several things, really only two. First, as embodied beings, we each see the world as something, from a perspective. And as Martha Nussbaum put it, we do not see the world raw. We don't see people or religions, even our own religion, or lack thereof, or rejection thereof, raw and straight. We don't see it raw, we don't study it raw. There's no clean, objective religion lab, no bench to sit on or vantage point from which to see with a God's eye view. As a human being, then humility would seem to be called for. But the second point here under embodiment is that this is good news. Embodied human existence is our way, our gift, our way of being in this universe, in the world, our access to the universe, our only access to the universe, I would claim, and even to the transcendent. So we don't have a choice on that set of constraints. And that is good. And there are good places to stand, traditions to stand within, wisdoms to have been born into or to have acquired. There are faithful ways of seeing, of being, of living and moving and having our being on this good earth, and of studying. And that, again, is good news in these challenging times for the academy and for the study of religion. And I am a loyal enough GTU grad that I do believe that one piece of the good news is that here there is a place for situated study that can be mutually respectful across the fields of study, the disciplines, the denominations that formed these original schools, and religions. And Judith has shown us how to make a place and set a time for that to happen, and shown us how to do it, given us practices and habits that hold us in the struggle entailed as we build what Bell Hooks would call beloved, or beloved in her accent, beloved community. So we shall not cease, Judith, from critical analysis and reflection, and even construction of new models, creation of new language out of old language for what we're seeing. And we need not, I would say, give up the field of religious study to the secular, disenchanted flattening that the techno-commercial machine so seductively insists is the real reality. That's one framing, but it's not the only one. So now, more than ever, bearing witness to the transcendent, querying it, and each other around it needs embodied, red-blooded practitioners with lived experience that we have not forsaken or forgotten. To our peril, we study religion in a way that strips people of their stories, or of their deep wisdom, of their lived knowledge. What Judith has done so brilliantly is to make room for many, many stories, for many, many approaches, critiques, and ways of being in this amazing, grandeur-charged world. She's shown us how to leave room for the skeptic and for the amazed, while insisting on careful study from us all. Amen.
Elizabeth Ingenthron represents the Jewish Voice for Peace organisation, and as such doubtless works daily with the pressing challenges of enabling decent and dignified dialogues between reluctant, if not intractable, foes. As a recent student of Judith's, her perspective on the enduring value of collaborative learning is what she has valued beyond measure. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Morning. I will segue from Bonnie's lovely ending. I'll segue from Bonnie's lovely ending. I would like to share a story with you today. And so when I was finishing my master's, in the last year of my master's degree, I did a reading course with a professor and set the syllabus on religion and education, and that's central student. So I was able to come here and study for 7 wonderful years, the 7-year plan, and completed my dissertation, and I thought at the end, wow, how far I've come and how far off field I went from where I started reading Judith's book. And then this symposium came up, and I reread Understanding Other Religious Worlds, and I thought, no, I'm actually still in the horizon that Judith opened up for me. I'm still there in that world, and I probably should have acknowledged that more in the dissertation, but I can't go back now. So, sorry, I'll acknowledge it here. So how I understand Judith's book is that she brings together an assemblage of learning theories and then situates herself in the history of religious education, specifically Christian religious education. And it's an unassuming looking book, but she has these large systems in her mind and conveys them through this work. So in my own work, what I did was take a thread of the learning theories and particularly critical pedagogy. I kind of got very tunnel vision on critical pedagogy, and then brought in critical whiteness studies as another theoretical lens, which looks at the white racial category and white supremacy. So I bring together critical pedagogy and critical whiteness studies to understand Jewish identity in the US and Israel-Palestine, and how we can understand the connections between these places and the peoples there through those lenses. And I did it in a very theoretical way, and now have ended up in an organization that does it in a practical way, which is a blessing. So what I want to say basically is I very much appreciate that you made that room for me to have these wonderful years, and that you challenged me and questioned me. There were several dissertation drafts, so that was good. And just most of all, that you kept, the doors were open for exploration the whole time, wherever I went. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
The last 2 speakers are those to whom we have already heard. We all owe such a debt of gratitude, for it was they who initiated this day, and then they who have worked so tirelessly to bring this to fruition. Gratitude is such a powerful sentiment, but such is the level of deep and abiding gratitude that each feel for their beloved professor, that I leave it first to Sophia and then to Emily to share with us something of what has evoked such a loving response, and something of how Judith's mentorship of them has informed and influenced their respective academic journeys with her over the past 7 or 8 years. So Sophia first. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm her student, I'm her mentee, and then this kind of conference is really my Korean way to express my Thank you. Yesterday we practiced, and I really try not to be emotional. But really hard. As a scholar of Christian spirituality and a professor at a liberal arts college, I'm extremely grateful to Judith Berling's scholarship and teaching, which emphasizes a collaborative conversation learning model. When I began my doctoral studies at GTU, I quickly heard about her and her interdisciplinary seminar. But I wondered why I should take that seminar, because I'm a student of Christian spirituality. I know where I'm going. I know what I'm doing. Even felt uncomfortable doing so. Of course, I did not know at the time that I would end up using interdisciplinary approach constantly and all throughout my academic career. During the interdisciplinary seminar at GTU, I learned how to work with other students whose academic interests and religious affiliations were unfamiliar to me. However, over the time, the seminar gave me unexpected joy and new learning experience. I have Julia as my classmate when we took the interdisciplinary seminar. The seminar was really excellent without Judith. That year you were sabbatical. My wonderful classmates brought their own ideas of research, and we listened and engaged one another with the ideas. For me, the listening, it was almost a spiritual exercise and deeply related with theological reflection. The mode of collaborative and dialogical learning, focusing on the listening aspect, led to an affectionate and deep level of knowledge. The stories my classmates brought in the class included the context and the lived experience of a certain religion or a very specific faith journey. Throughout my dissertation and subsequent research, I found myself listening to many different experiences and voices in both myself and in others. And these have provided me with my research topics in Christian spirituality. In our multicultural society, learning through listening bridges the gap between the dominant culture and the marginalized ones, between the particular experience as the object of study, particularly Christian spirituality, and the discourse as the given normative description. Or it fills the gap between a particular story within a specific context and the narrative described in textbooks. By crossing boundaries of religions and cultures, I found that ample meaning can be created in an in-between space. It embraces post-colonial, postmodern, and feminist passion, but it is not limited to them. Judith's collaborative conversation learning model pays attention to various voices and to many layers of text within a religion, or two religions, or more than two religions. And this approach has helped me to better teach religious studies classes. As Judith explains in her book, Understanding Other Religious Worlds, in multi-religious classroom environment, students are all the other to one another, and one specific religious language cannot be standard. In my Holy Names University classroom, I found the students practice Hinduism, Islam, Sikh, Buddhism, besides Christianity as their own religion or their cultural heritage. In this setting, I recognize that the collaborative conversation model is more than necessary. For my millennial students who lack concrete religious ground, it is important to learn about one another through listening as a process of appropriation. However, in the interpretation offered by my student that I teach, I find that many inaccurate Christian conceptions are used or misused as the lens of their own experience and their own interpretation. Out of that consideration, I have inserted the mapping project, which indicates what each student holds as his or her own framework and own explanation of terms, which belong to their own framework in my course syllabus. Lots of my students use the concept of karma, their own framework. Whenever I ask them, they said, "Oh yeah, karma is going, and did you see the bumper sticker?" Or like, even though they say this is karma, when I listen to them, it's almost like a poor theology about punishing God. But they use it as karma. Sounds fancy, right? Do you know it is about Hinduism? And, well, whatever, right? This is typical my student. By facilitating listening process to one another, they can learn about different religions and find a way to adapt all or some of them their own life spirituality. In this class, I should function as a facilitator who creates a safe space for students who do not have self-confidence yet by giving attention and confidence. And I learned from my teacher, Judith. I believe her collaborative learning model is similar to her teaching, which always begins with listening to her students and affirming their academic imagination and creativity. One wisdom that I experienced from Judith is trust students before critique them, listening to their dream and gently nudging them to the next step. The hermeneutic of love is equivalent to Judith's collaborative learning model. 감사합니다.
Hi, I'm Emily Wu. I had 2 hours of sleep last night, but I'm so glad you're here. I might just fall asleep anytime after this. I'm just I had 2 cups of coffee. I'll survive. So Judith was my doctoral advisor, now long-time mentor, friend, and my ultimate dim sum partner. My reflection today is going to be on how Judith has influenced me on considering the importance of creating space, genuine, sincere, safe space, as part of the boundary crossing process. So let me talk a little bit about trees. I teach Introduction to Asian Religions courses to undergraduates and sometimes graduate students. In the beginning of the semester, I would give my students an exercise. This is instruction. Go find a tree and spend 15 minutes with it. Get to know the tree, report back to us in next class. With minimal instructions, the students approach the exercise in many ways. Over the past few years, I've been seeing some trends. Some students would focus on the discomfort of the experience. OMG, I'm so distracted by the cars passing by and I couldn't focus. Or I was worried that people would think I'm crazy standing right next to a tree for 15 minutes. Or I was having a separation anxiety from being away from my phone. Some report on detailed knowledge of the tree. The tree was about 10 feet tall, the bark was a little rough, there were ants crawling up the sides, and a few really nerdy ones would even Google up and try to scientifically identify the tree afterwards. Okay, and a few found themselves pondering about the symbolic meanings of a tree, how the branching of a tree reminded them of their family lineages, and how the moment being alone beside a non-talking living thing became somehow profound. There was one particular student who actually got me into trouble. That semester, I decided that we would all go out together and do this exercise. We had this residence for the retired Dominican sisters across the street, where the courtyard outside that residence had the most amazing trees. And so we all found our trees, and I looked over across the yard. I was in awe, and the sisters inside the residence windows were in full horror. And we watched that one student very swiftly going up a tree. Probably went about 2 floors high. Me and the student both got scolded for him doing something dangerous. Bless our hearts, the sisters were really concerned about, and we appreciate that concern. Afterwards, I asked the student why he went up that tree, and he told me. He said, I wanted to see what a tree would see if a tree could see. He said that he was short, and he wanted to know what it would be like to be something standing really tall and looking down. So Judith has this learning model for learning across religious boundaries, and I would argue that it's actually a really effective one to consider crossing any kind of boundary, which makes her understanding other religious worlds, the famous, by now, purple book that everybody refers to, addresses. So to grossly simplify a much more nuanced process, right? Basically, Judith argues that we need to recognize differences, take the initiative to cross over to the other side, hang out on the other side to really be there, and then come back to reflect on what we are and how things have changed in ourselves and for our own identities. I grew up in North America, but very much in Asian America. There's such a thing where the Asian community is so large in number that there's always enough people around to understand a more or less shared worldview. But to mainstream America, I'm also the other with that capital O, and now the other, teaching the other religions, or the non-Christian religions of not here Asia. Some of my students also come from Asian backgrounds, but most are not, and I've been teaching in Catholic and Catholic heritage institutions. A lot of times I don't feel like I'm crossing boundaries with my students, but sort of seeing them from the other side of the mirror from Alice in Wonderland, waving at them to come on over. So this is when I started to better understand something implicit about Judith's process of teaching and learning. What's explicit is that crossing over, hopefully not just once like some tourists going on an exotic vacation and coming back with lots of souvenirs and photos, but to go back and forth, until one actually has an embodied understanding of what it's like on either side of that divide. Hopefully, still very conscious that there will always be things yet to be reconciled. What is implicit, which Judith does so well in her own teaching, is to create that space that Sophia mentioned, where people feel safe to take some risks. And what I've seen Judith do, how she's been able to create that space, is to be very present and open to doing that crossing herself. Every time, all the time. It takes a lot of courage to be doing that. If I want to understand the perspective of a tree, I would really need to consider going up that tree to at least take a look. This is where I think Judith has internalized what the Confucians and the Taoists have tried to cultivate by saying that they want to follow the way. It's cultivation that takes authentic intention to not only observe what is there, but to really be present and be real in what we are trying to understand. This is something I'm inspired to cultivate too. The space grounding, the space making that Judith does so well. I'm nowhere close, still have a long way to go. So thank you, Judith. I more dim sum. But thank you.
Thank you to the panellists for being so attentive to time constraints. I think what we've been fed is a veritable feast of pedagogy, of environmental racism, of embodiment, of movement from theoretical to practical, the gift of being culturally responsive, the responsibility of crossing over and over and over, and above all, the critical importance of modelling in ourselves as teachers what it is that we have the power to expect of students to do. I want now to give us a moment to just let all of that settle for just a little while, and maybe encourage us to talk to each other as we are, as where we are in the room for now. So take about 5 minutes to just chat to each other, and then we'll have the opportunity to have some kind of chaotic engagement, no doubt. I'll do my best with that.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you. Yeah, it was great. I mean, without planning intentionally to have this convergence, there are some key threads that wound through it all.
I never thought about the climate ecological issue or the interreligious dialogue. Yeah. It's just really good. I did a course in this. Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right, yeah. Are disappearing as we speak.
And also last of the health issues.
Yeah.
These days, health issues, disease, and
I feel from some students thinking
Yeah.
it's too much.
Yeah.
I was teaching one doctor nurses and I'm trying to introduce them to the world, not
Right.
just, so.
did you write an article? Did you publish an article with this theme?
No, I haven't. I would, yeah, I would like to. I want to teach it more at the GTU. When I come back from my sabbatical, I want to think long term about taking the idea seminar and sort of ecologizing and seeing if we could do something. And maybe even Rita Sherman over there, who's also interested in environmental issues from a Hindu perspective. And I think that the apocalyptic cognitive dissonance when people shut down because it is just overwhelming. What can one person do? And the global enormity of it seems intractable. And I think Judith's work is so optimistically the play, the imagination that she has, the notion that to encounter the other is a spiritual discipline. I love it. The embodied aspect of this. That this kind of learning can spiritually transform you inside, and that is part of what everyone needs to do to address the bigger.
You know what? Did you say hermeneutic of love? Yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful. I wrote that down. Yeah. Yeah, and Bonnie, you had that phrase about the disenchanted, flattening, technocratic. That was great. Which the hermeneutic of love is like the antidote to.
Charles Taylor,
Yes, yes. I'm thinking because I'm writing about book proposal about
Fantastic.
but we made it just much more like a simple format, but
Yeah.
interesting that we will put together. So I'm thinking about I met a other conference, the editor of Crossroads. He wanna support idea.
Uh-huh.
So I'm thinking about we all put together.
That'd be great. And maybe have Judith.
Yeah, Judith
weigh in
already
in
said
some
that
way,
she
yeah.
will put one chapter and
Yeah.
What I care about the documentation too, I don't have heard this at all.
Yeah. Right. And I didn't talk about it, but just the power of seeing how Judith encourages students to be so creative in the presentation. With the imagination.
yes, yes. You want to do more? Yeah. Why don't you use this one and let me start? Yeah, we can.
That would be great. Yeah, Sophia. I think.
Okay, friends, can we come back into the room?
Like come out of this. It's fabulous.
Thanks, Emily. So what we're inviting now are questions from those of you who have particular concerns or delights that have been raised by what our speakers have said. So for the next 15 or so minutes, I'll do my best to facilitate questions from the audience. And you'll just need to forgive me if some of you I don't know your names. So I will describe an article of clothing. And Emily will bring the microphone out to you. It's always that moment of pause, isn't there? Yet you were so animated a moment ago. What happened? Sister in the middle.
Hi, everyone. I actually have a question for you, Emily. You were talking about the explicit and implicit ways of boundary crossing, explicit being going back and forth, and implicit being creating a safe space or a context in order to do the boundary crossing. And I was wondering if you can talk more about that implicit way of doing it and examples of different ways of cultivating that type of space that you were alluding to during your talk.
Thanks. That's the really hard part, right? And I was thinking about how I could better articulate it and how I could better articulate how Judith does it. And what I realized is that the hard part is that it's so embodied, you have to be there for it, and that's why I think that presence is the most important thing that I could like pin my finger onto. And beyond that, call Judith and have more dim sum with her, and that helps.
Hi, this is more a comment. Hi, Judith. The word safe was used a number of times, including in your talk, and I think that's a really important concept and it's an important need, but it's a limited one. So this past year I was working at Mills College, and the term they prefer to use there is brave space. And I think that's really more fitting for Judith and for climbing trees. You don't climb trees if you're trying to be safe, but if you're trying to be brave and take those risks, which I think are absolutely essential for the kind of work and encounters that we're talking about. So that's just a comment I would add.
Lovely, thank you. Next person to ask a question will get a muffin. Bill Countryman.
As one factor that was perhaps a little less represented in the comments, one of Judith's colleagues over many years in the interdisciplinary studies, I want to say what a delight it always was to work with her, partly because of that welcome. That might be a good word too, to go along with brave and safe. The welcome that she gave to people's interests and concerns, and
with such blessed assurance that what we have contributed was of deep value. So we move now to this afternoon into slightly more elevated headspace and to scholarly contributions from very impressive speakers. But first I want to hand over to Dean Arthur Holder for instructions, very important instructions. Thank you all.
Great. We've all learned here the importance of beginning with identifying our social location. I think in this occasion, we're supposed to identify our Judith location. So, as you've heard, I am for 5 more weeks the Dean of the GTU, which means I am one of Judith's successors, but then she's going to be my interim successor, so I don't know.